And that's why the overwhelming proportion of people who are in prisons are male. Now, do you want to equalize that? What about bricklayers? They're 99% male. And we've got about 3/4 of the population now in universities in the humanities and social sciences are female.
Yeah.
Are we going to equalize that? Men work longer hours. They work more dangerous jobs. They're more likely to move. They're more likely to work outside. They're more likely to participate in jobs in the STEM fields that are scalable. They make more money for those reasons. And that's all hidden under the idea that the reason...
What do you understand by equality, Sophie? What does it mean to you?
Freedom.
Can you be more... Is it equality of opportunity? Is it equal pay across the board? Is it something more than that?
I think equality's better for everyone. I
Yeah,
think,
okay.
you know, and I'm really delighted, you know, I love my job because it's an optimistic and a hopeful job, which is about creating more choices for people. I'm interested in people being able to have different choices and having equality of outcome.
Aha, well, so you're going to have choices and equality of outcome. What if people choose different things, which is what they've been doing in Scandinavia? So the Scandinavian countries have moved more towards gender equality than any other countries, and the personality differences in Scandinavia have increased rather than decreased, and the proportion of women who are choosing STEM fields has decreased rather than increased. So as cultures become more gender neutral, the number of women who choose STEM fields decreases.
What do you mean by
increasing.
STEM fields?
So science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So if you let men and women make their choices, what actually happens is that they specialize in different situations, and you don't get equality of outcome.
Could they not have been programmed to have those views from the moment we raise them and give boys Lego and construction?
No, because what happens is that as countries get more egalitarian, which means there's less programming of that sort, the differences get larger, not smaller. And the scientific data on that is clear, and most of it was generated by people who have a left-leaning bias, so you can't blame it on conservative scientists. It was a shock to everyone to find that out.
Sophie,
I think the difference between Jordan and me is that we look at evidence and we lean towards different theories. So Jordan's theory is very much evolutionary, you know, that there are inherent differences in men and women. Mine is very much more social role theory, if you like, and that men and women are taking on different roles due to the expectations that society puts on them. And it's interesting that Jordan frequently cites Scandinavian countries where they've made more, like there's nowhere in the world that women are equal, but Scandinavia has made the most progress towards shared parenting, etc.
Yep.
That said, it's not done yet. There's nowhere in the world where this is done yet.
But it's having the opposite effect that the gender equality types predicted. Opposite, not the same. And it isn't a theory, it's actually data driven by tens of thousands of surveys and the best scientific literature on the topic. It's not a theory, and I didn't come about it because of my political perspective. I looked at the data. What it showed was that as countries become more egalitarian, the differences between men and women grow. They don't shrink.
So what I'm interested in is data and analysis as well, and I'm particularly interested in the ones presented, such as the ones by the University of Southern California, which discovered that change towards gender equality is actually being slowed by beliefs that are legitimizing social inequalities on the basis of sex. And I'm also interested, I mean, like Jordan, I look at the data and I look at the studies, and I'm really also very much interested in studies like the analysis that was done by the American Psychological Society, which looked at 45 analysis of whether there's sex difference over 20 years. And its conclusion was that men and women are basically alike in terms of personality, in terms of cognitive ability, in terms of leadership. But what it did find was that media depictions of men and women as fundamentally different perpetuate misconceptions, as does workplace bias.
Oh God, so it's my fault.
So, no, well, you know, you're leaving soon. It's okay.
Men and women actually are more the same than they are different. But the issue is that small differences at the population level can turn into very large differences at the extreme. So, for example, men and women are broadly similar with regards to aggression, although men tilt a little bit more towards aggression. So that if you picked a random person out of the population, male and female, and you guessed that the male was more aggressive, you'd be right 60% of the time. But if you take the 1 in 100 most aggressive people, they're all male. And that's why the overwhelming proportion of people who are in prisons are male. Now, do you want to equalize that, just out of curiosity? What about bricklayers? They're 99% male. And we've got about 3/4 of the population now in universities in the humanities and social sciences are female.
Yeah.
Are we going to equalize that? And men work longer hours, they work more dangerous jobs, they're more likely to move, they're more likely to work outside, they're more likely to participate in jobs in the STEM fields that are scalable, they make more money for those reasons, and that's all hidden under the idea that the reason that men and women make different amounts of money is because of their gender. It's a very simplistic analysis, and trying to
Michael,
address
I was just going to say, Sophie, can you come back on that?
What I'm trying to equalise is opportunity and choice.
Fine, let's
I-
equalise
and I-
choice.
You agree
Absolutely.
on that.
But we won't get equal outcome that way.
And I think that what happens then, nobody knows, because we've never done it yet.
We do know.
But
We
I
know
think
what's happened in
it has-
Scandinavia.
But it's not
Scandinavia's
fully
not
got there yet.
finished
No, but it's going in the opposite direction that everyone predicted, and
You know,
strongly.
I think one of the things I loved about Jordan's book, which I speed read last night, so forgive me, Jordan, I've not read every line. But one of my favourite rules in Jordan's book is Rule 9, which says, assume the person you are listening to might know something you don't. And I think that in a country where men outnumber women by 2 to 1 in Parliament, in local government, where women's voices are not equally represented in media, where our education systems still are teaching boys and girls ideas of pink and blue. Yep. What I'm trying to do is work with thousands of optimistic, hopeful people for change.
Your boss called the gender pay gap a burning injustice. Is it?
Yes, it is, because there should be inequality of opportunity. There needs to be the same rights. But you know, something that surprised
outcome,
me,
quality of
that
outcome.
neither of you, and equality of outcome, sure, all of that. But the one thing both of you haven't mentioned is the biological difference, which unfortunately affects women's career prospects, whether we like
Babies
it or not.
as well, yeah.
Babies. And that does cause a problem. You know, if I were to take a sabbatical from a corporation for a while, it's going to set me back slightly. And it is a problem that biologically it's women who have babies, not men.
Sure, but that's why the Women's Equality Party is the only party in the UK that's got policies around shared parental leave.
She's so political.
We're the only party that has got fully costed plans for universal free childcare. One of the other things we want to do is to have a look at curriculums, to have more female role models, to encourage girls, because so long as we still see STEM as a boys' area that we're trying to get girls into, it's not going to work. We need to do the work we're doing on care, get more boys thinking about, nursing, teaching, more role models for boys in schools.
And
that's the way you break
gains
it all
on
down.
programs like EastEnders, The Archers, that's helped them a lot.
Right, so listen, I have to draw things to a conclusion. Can I just say how wonderful, 3 people, diverse political views, diverse views on many other issues, that get along famously and have wonderful conversations. Thank you.
There's only 2 reasons that men and women differ. One is cultural, and the other is biological. And if you minimize the cultural differences, you maximize the biological differences. I know everyone's shocked when they hear this. This isn't shocking news. People have known this in the scientific community for at least 25 years.
Why do you think so many young men are following you? Because you have a lot of your audience.
Because I want
are
the
young
best for them. Genuinely.
men.
I'm encouraging them.
More than you do for young women?
No, not
So
not
why
in the
do you
least.
think so many are young men?
Oh, well, I think part of it's technological fluke. I mean, I came to prominence, at least in part, on YouTube, because I put my university lectures there, and it happens to be the case that 80% of the people who watch YouTube are young men. So there's that, and it's hard to know how to factor that in exactly. But then I think that young women are encouraged a lot, which is fine as far as I'm concerned. But I think that that's less true for young men now, because we believe that there's something pernicious about male competence and activity. It's part of I suppose it's part of the notion that the best way to characterize Western society is as a tyrannical patriarchy, which is a appalling doctrine as far as I'm concerned.
How come is that?
Well, it's not a tyrannical patriarchy. So it's not tyrannical, that's the first thing. Certainly not compared to any other governmental form that currently exists and has ever existed.
What you're doing and doing now as well is challenging the the idea of gender equality. Why do you think that can be a problem? The idea of gender equality.
I don't think that equality of opportunity is a problem. I think that's a great thing, and that anyone with any sense champions equality of opportunity. I mean, even if you're purely selfish, say, and purely self-centered, you'd want to set up an economy where everyone who had ability could be maximally exploited by everyone else, because then we can all benefit from each other's talents. And so equality of opportunity is an absolutely useful fundamental principle.
So where's
but
the
that has
problem?
nothing to do with equality of outcome. Those things aren't even in the same conceptual universe. And to strive for equality of outcome is, well, it's a fool's game and likely to be extraordinarily, it has proved to be in the past, extraordinarily dangerous, as well as impossible. The biggest differences between men and women in the world in terms of temperament and interest are in Scandinavia, and they've maximized as a consequence of your egalitarian policies.
What do you mean by that?
It means that the more egalitarian your state, the bigger the personality differences between men and women. That's like
How do you measure that? How do you know that?
Oh, well, psychologists have perfected, at least to some degree, the measure of personality over the last 30 years with very advanced statistical models. And so what you do is you offer men and women well-validated tests of preference and of personality. And you do that all across the world with tens of thousands of people in multi-country samples. And then you look at the difference between men and women. And then you rank order that by wealth and egalitarian social policy. And what you find is the more egalitarian the society, the more different the men and women become.
Is this something you can recognize, or is it?
I would say, for me, it's quite a simple question, actually. Do we want that our sons and daughters should have the same opportunities and the same dreams or hopes for the good thing, or no? And for me, it's simple to answer that. It's yes, of course. So for me, equality and gender equality is very, very important. For me, also when we talk about gender equality, it's important for me to learn my daughter that her mom can lead and show the way, and her dad can hug and kiss her and show feelings. And I think that's something very important for the hoods where kids grow up, to show feelings, to have these gender equality discussions, to show her a way of opportunities and to strive forward. And it's important both for lonely men, lonely young men, but also for women that feel this roof of glass. They need to fight and to struggle the roof of glass to be successful in their lives.
Do you agree on this?
I think that equality of opportunity is a perfectly reasonable proposition. I mean, I have a daughter and a wife. I do everything and many female clients and who I've consulted with and helped, and in many cases helped accelerate the development of their career tremendously. It's obviously of great utility to encourage forward striving in young people and people in general. That's not the issue in the least. The issue is the outcome.
Yeah, well, then why do you think the outcome, and these countries where the outcome is more equal, why do you think that leads to bigger differences between the sexes?
Because there's only two reasons that men and women differ. One is cultural, and the other is biological. And if you minimize the cultural differences, you maximize the biological differences. So I know everyone's shocked when they hear this. This isn't shocking news. People have known this in the scientific community for at least 25 years. And it's been replicated in the last month 3 times in 3 separate samples, including in Science, which is the world's greatest scientific magazine by a large margin. And it isn't a small effect, it's a huge effect.
But excuse me, what does it mean? Does it mean that Scandinavian men and women are having more difficulties meeting each other, talking to each other than other places?
No, not necessarily, but it does mean that there are reasons for differences in participation rates in different occupations that aren't a consequence of socialization. So, for example, this is especially true at the extremes. So, for example, on average, men are more interested in things and women are more interested in people. And that's actually the biggest difference we know of psychologically between men and women. And even though men and women are quite similar, all things considered, the extremes make a difference. So you imagine that in order to become an engineer, look, obviously not everyone becomes an engineer. You have to have a particular temperamental proclivity to become an engineer. You have to be extraordinarily interested in things rather than people. Well, most of those people are men. And if you want to become a nurse, well, then you have to be much more interested in people than you are in things. And most of those people are women. And so you get differences in occupational choice that are also, by the way, quite great in Scandinavia, especially in the case of engineering and nursing, that are mostly due to biological differences, and you cannot minimize that by social engineering. So, and it's not a bad thing. Like, look, one of the things you want to ask yourself is that, what is the purpose of setting up a society that offers maximal equality of opportunity? And one of the answers is that you maximize people's free choice. And if you maximize free choice, then you also maximize differences in choice between people. And so you can't have both of those.
But of course it will have differences in choice, of course, because we are human beings. But I can't see why it differs between me and Skavlan, for instance. But of course it differs in biological things, but not in choices, because I think more how we raise them, how we live, education, a sort of culture, attitudes form a human being, whether or not they are a girl or a boy when they grow up. Mm-hmm. And if I raise my daughter to become a leader, to be self-confident, to have a high education, for instance, I think she will have a good platform to become a civil engineer, to become a CEO of a company, or to become a nurse.
Well, that is what people who think that the differences between people who are primarily culturally constructed believe, but it's not what the evidence suggests.
Okay, we don't agree on that.
One thing answer for everything.
You could let
it's like
me.
It's part of the patriarchal institution.
Unless it's true, right?
Look,
Women do more,
it's not
much
capitalism.
more.
Well, for God's sake. I'm not hearing what you think. I'm hearing how you're able to represent the ideology you were taught. And it's not that interesting.
Did you have different ambitions for your daughter and for your son?
Some of them were different. I encouraged my daughter in her desire to be a mother, which is not something I did with my son.
Did you encourage him in his desire to be a father?
Absolutely.
Right. So you encourage both of them to be a parent.
Right, but those are different.
Yeah.
I
believe.
And yeah, I mean, and in some sense, I think it's harder for young women because, of course, the problem of integrating family with career is a more complex problem for women to solve. So, and I spent a lot of time talking to her about how she might solve that. I wouldn't say that we came up with anything that was spectacularly original or successful, but I at least let her know that whatever pathway she chose was fine with me as long as she was being honest with herself about what it was that she wanted. But also that, I'm not a fan of the idea that the most fundamental orientation that a person is likely to have in their life is career. I don't believe that's true for most people. I certainly don't believe it's true for most women. And I think the evidence supports that claim quite straightforwardly. So,
however, it is the only thing that you get paid for under capitalism. Right?
Man, live.
But that's
How can
true.
you say something like that? It's so cliched.
Well,
it's so painful to hear that.
It may be cliche, but it nonetheless is true, right?
Look,
Women do
it's
more,
not
much
capitalism.
more. Well,
for God's sake.
It is.
No, it isn't. You have to invest into a child for 18 years before they have any economic utility. Mm-hmm. It's a consequence of delayed economic utility. We don't know how to monetize it. It's not a consequence of capitalism. It's a consequence of the fact that human beings have an 18-year dependency. How do you monetize that, even in principle?
Well,
we don't know.
We did used to send them up chimneys, to be fair. And at that point, what's
true.
really interesting is at that point, children were seen as being much more the property of the man. I mean, as they become economically useless, all the legal studies show that that's when we start moving to a model of female custody, right? Because it was about caring labour. But this is the point I'm making. Is
Look, I'll tell you, there are plenty of men who are not very happy about the model of female custody. And that would, include the 85% of men who are essentially denied 50-50 custody when they divorce and have young children. So I wouldn't think that one of our major problems, or at least a major unidimensional problem, is the proclivity of men to foist off the custody of their children onto women. There's certainly another side of that argument.
There is, and I do think that actually a lot of anger has been generated by the way we have in Britain anyway, or England and Wales, we have an adversarial fault-based divorce system, and that's something that's changing. But what it does is encourage people to come in on day one and say, if you want to get divorced, you're going to have to make out a case that the other person has been a bastard.
It doesn't matter, because if you move to a non-fault-based divorce system, then all that happens is the fault shifts to who should get custody.
You have a ridiculous situation where couples who say, well, actually, we've just grown apart, nonetheless, unless they want to wait 5 years or 2 years for separation, they have to go in and plead unreasonable behaviour to get a divorce and start splitting up their assets. That's the joy of no-fault divorce, is that you don't have to make those contested cases. You can simply say, our marriage is no longer working, and part ways without going into all of that acrimony. That seems quite sensible to me.
It also seems quite naive to me.
Well,
I've seen very few non-acrimonious divorces. They're very hard on kids. So I don't think anything that makes them easier is a very good idea, unless you don't think that marriage is a useful institution. And if you think that it's part of the patriarchal tyranny, then you might think that as well. So, but it's a very useful institution, mostly for kids.
I agree that I'm married. Modern marriage has a lot to recommend it. I do also think it is a patriarchal institution. It is literally...
Of course you think that,
Well,
because you think virtually everything that occurs in our society is a patriarchal institution. And it's easy to think that, because then you only have to think one thing.
You could
have a one-thing answer for everything.
You could let
it's like
me...
It's part of the patriarchal institution.
I don't think you're obeying the rule that says maybe treat people as if they have something worth hearing, so...
I'm not making a case for the patriarchal tyranny.
I'm gonna
and
make
I don't think you are either. I think that you're making a case that's like a universally cliched case for the patriarchal tyranny. I don't see too much of you reflected in your articles at all.
Why do women change their names on marriage traditionally?
I don't know exactly. Why do you think they do?
Because it was to symbolise the transfer of their ownership from one family to another family. That's why in The Handmaid's Tale you have off Warren, off Glenn.
Oh God, Margaret Atwood. Well, she was just about devoured by the feminists last year, so that was something interesting to observe.
I think she made a very good point. She wasn't devoured by all feminists. I'm a feminist. I thought what she said about due process in cases like that is perfectly reasonable.
Mm-hmm. Well, many people didn't.
No, but then, guess what? This is on the internet, you can find someone who disagrees with pretty much anything.
Mm-hmm.
But so why do you think women change their names when they get married traditionally? If it's not about transfer of property ownership traditionally?
I don't know if I have an opinion about that. The specific reasons for that, I'd have to look into it for a fair amount of time before I decided it, but I certainly wouldn't boil it down to a unidimensional argument about the ownership of women by men. So,
okay.
I mean, the part of the problem too is with this sort of discussion is that and this is why I consider it a manifestation of ideological possession. It's predictable.
Well, that's what
knowing your stance on.
But having a coherent ideology does mean that it is predictable, because
you don't need an ideology.
It is one logical thing that flows from another, and all those pieces tessellate together. So what I find very interesting about your thinking, I find it quite slightly baffling, is that I don't really see how all the pieces fit together. You say that you're not, you believe in God, but there's a lot of emphasis about going back to...
No, I actually say I act as if God exists.
Right. But,
which is actually my definition of belief.
Okay, but that then doesn't, to me, tessellate very obviously with your insistence that we know actually it's just about pure science, and there's not a, because I can
what insistence that it's just about pure science?
Well,
I wrote Maps of Meaning. There's no insistence in that it's just about pure science.
Okay, but you make appeals to
science. There were two very different.
You make appeals to science all the time. You say, well, this is what the literature says, and the trouble with God is that ultimately you can't say this is what the literature says. There is no literature.
Which is why I don't say anything about the scientific status of God, apart from what can be experienced maybe under certain conditions of what would you call chemical-induced mysticism, which seems to be something that you can say something scientifically about. But I see that there's two different realms, right? There's a realm of values and a realm of facts. And in the realm of facts, science reigns supreme. But it doesn't in the realm of values. You have to look elsewhere. That was what the humanities were for, before they got, what would you say, hijacked by ideologues. And the idea that something should be consistent. You were talking about the necessity for consistency in ideology. It's like, I'm not hearing what you think. I'm hearing how you're able to represent the ideology you were taught. And it's not that interesting, because I don't know anything about you. I could replace you with someone else who thinks the same way. And that means you're not here. That's what it means. It's not pleasant. So you're not integrating the specifics of your personal experience with what you've been taught to synthesize something that's genuine and surprising, and engaging in a narrative sense as a consequence. And that's the pathology of ideological possession. It's not good. You have to have signed consent before making any physical move. And then that's so what? Really? Who thought that up? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. You know how awkward that would be?
First of all, thank you very much for being here and helping us to wake up. I really appreciate it. So my question is, as a redeemed progressive, what is the key to empowering men in the Me Too age while maintaining healthy boundaries and strong behavioural expectations?
We've had relatively reliable birth control since 1960. Okay, that's not very long. And we underestimate the unbelievable technological triumph of birth control. It's the hydrogen bomb, it's the transistor, like it's a major league transformation in human interaction. Women are now free from involuntary reproduction. That's never been the case in the entire history of the planet. Okay, we don't know exactly what to do about that. Okay, so the first idea in the 60s was, hell, let's party. And you know, you could see why. It's like, what the rules for not engaging in promiscuous sexual intercourse seemed to have vanished. So we had a couple of decades of experimentation. It's like, well, how'd that go? Little hard on the family, I would say. That's not so good for kids. AIDS, that wasn't a plus. Could have killed us all. And it mutated, particularly to take advantage of promiscuous sex, because viruses are very tricky things. So it turns out that sex is a little bit more complicated than we thought. Well, it actually turns out that it's a lot more complicated than we think. Okay, and now it's 50, 60 years later, and we're trying to sort this out. It's like, well, when is it okay to have sex? Exactly. And when is it not okay to have sex? And what does it mean that it's okay? And what does consent mean? And the answer to that is, well, we never used to have to think these things through, because the rule was don't have sex until you get married. That was the rule. Now that isn't the rule. Okay, so what's the rule? Well, we're not having a conversation about the rule. We're waiting till someone does something that seems like it might be untoward and then mobbing them and trying to extract the rule out that way. And it's not a very effective way of doing it. You know, you want to decrease campus rape? That's easy. Get rid of alcohol. No one has that conversation. It's like, I did my PhD work on alcohol. 50% of the people who are murdered are drunk, and 50% of the people who kill them are drunk. And almost all the date rape situations are consequences of excess intoxication. But yet there's a party culture on campuses and anything goes. And you also have this strange thing, especially on the radical left, which is unbelievably paradoxical, where absolutely every form of sexual expression imaginable is 100% permissible because sex is fine, but it's so dangerous that while you're dancing with someone at a Princeton mixer, you have to ask them 2 or 3 times if it's okay for you to continue. And that's actually the case, by the way. I'm not making that up. It's like, well, both of those things can't be true. Now, what's happening, I think, on the Me Too end of things and the affirmative consent end of things is the old sexual taboos are reasserting themselves. The idea that we can extract sex out from emotional intimacy, and especially emotional intimacy, I would say, psychological intimacy, maybe even from long-term relationship, I don't believe it's a tenable idea. I don't think we can do it. And a lot of what we're seeing is the backlash against that. It's like, well, I feel used. You know, because one of the things that's happening on the really radical end of the anti-sexual abuse movement is the idea that, well, if you have intercourse with someone and then you regret it the next day, that's evidence that it wasn't consensual. Well, it is, in a sense, evidence that it wasn't consensual, because it's evidence that you didn't bloody well think it through, right? It was good for last night, but it's not good for today. It's not very wise. the question is, well, what constitutes consent? And we need to have a very serious conversation about that. Like, under what circumstances is it acceptable to give consent? But we're not mature enough to have that conversation. We want it both ways. We want to be able to do whatever we want, with whoever we want, whenever we want, with no consequences, and we want there never to be any trouble about consent. It's like, well, no, that's not going to happen. I don't think that sex works very well outside of committed relationships. I don't think there's any evidence that it does. There's a strong proclivity across cultures for the enforcement, social enforcement of long-term monogamy. And there's reasons for that. And I think you deviate from that at your peril. So now, if you want to deviate from that, there's all sorts of reasons to do it. And I can understand why people are interested in adventure and all of that. But, my sense also as a clinician is, you only really get to try out about 5 people in your life. You have to make a decision pretty damn quick. Like between 20 and 30, there's a lot of things to get straight, and long-term mate is usually one of them. And most of the time, people should be more careful with their sexual behavior when they're young, especially when they're drunk, than they are. And I just think it's so interesting that all of the taboo reconstruction is coming from the radical left. It's not what you'd expect at all. You'd think it'd be the damn right-wing Christians complaining about, sexual immorality. It's like, no, it's the radical lefties. You have to have signed consent before making any physical move. And then that's so what? Really? Who thought that up? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. You know how awkward that would be? You're supposed to be able to do a little bit of nonverbal reading, right? I mean, that's part of romance. You ever see a movie where the 2 people who are dating exchange consent notes? Like, that doesn't happen. So it's an unrealistic solution. But I think the real solution is that despite the fact that we have reliable birth control, we're going to have to relearn what the acceptable rules of propriety are with regards to sexual relationships. One of the things I often tell my young clients is, don't do anything physically with anyone that you wouldn't talk to them about. Because if you're too damn embarrassed to talk about it, well, maybe it's a little premature in the relationship to actually do it. And then there's harm in it. There's emotional harm in it on both parties. There's the cheapening of both parties. So it's going to take us a long time to sort this out. But hopefully we can do it in a serious manner, and it won't be merely a matter of mobbing those who seem to have made an error. I don't believe that there is moral casual sex, because I don't think sex is casual. I don't think anything about it is casual. I don't think there's any such thing as a casual sexual relationship. I don't believe that. I've never seen any evidence that that's the case. I think that there are people rationalize that constantly because they want to believe that short-term hedonistic gratification is ethically acceptable. And I don't think it is. I think that it trains you to treat yourself and other people as instrumental objects of short-term pleasure, obviously. Mm-hmm. Well, is that how you want to train yourself? How's that going to work you're going to have a long-term relationship at some point? How are you going to train yourself for that? Okay, so having said that, and then, how carefully should we conduct ourselves in sexual matters? I would say, well, as carefully as you conduct yourself in any matter of importance. And that stretches all the way up to the top, whatever the top is. You're going to treat the other person as if they're a divine locus of consciousness or a disposable pornographic entity. Well, those are the borders. Okay, but then you say, well, you have to practice. And there's truth in that. And how do you practice? And the answer is, well, that's one of the central complications of life. right? To get the balance between individual action and the whole domain of sexuality and reproduction right is perhaps there's no more difficult question, especially once you've solved the question of do you have enough to eat tomorrow? That would be the next one that pops up. But I don't think there is such a thing as casual sex. I think that's indistinguishable from masturbation, which I also don't regard as a particularly heroic act. And so, well,
T-shirts, masturbation, not a particularly
right.
act.
And I think people have that sense, and I don't think that that's culturally instantiated, because in some sense we've done everything we can to eradicate every last vestige of sexual shame, which I think in the final analysis is impossible, because there are all sorts of reasons for the persistence of sexual shame that have nothing to do with cultural context. And still, it's a furtive and underground activity. And the reason for that is because it's suboptimal for all sorts of reasons. Well, how much motivation does a young man need to overcome his fear of rejection and establish a relationship with a woman? And the answer to that is, we don't know, but sexual deprivation could easily be part of it. Because to do something difficult, you need a lot of motivation. You need frustration working for you. You need fear working for you. You need lust working for you. You need loneliness working for you. To bind a man and woman together, especially if they're going to produce children, this is a very, very difficult thing to do successfully. And so anything that interferes with that is to be viewed with extreme skepticism. And that's undoubtedly part of the reason that shame around hedonistic sexual activities remains a constant, despite our best attempts to eradicate it.
I think I would also say, just from my experience growing up, especially in university, it's not like it's seen on the outside, having casual sexual relationships, as this fun thing. It's not fun.
No.
And nobody thinks it's fun, especially women. So if you're around other girls and they're like, oh yeah, I hooked up with this guy, none of you guys are actually enjoying that.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's a lie that women tell each other.
Why?
I think because they think other people don't care. And because if you do it, it makes you feel bad enough that you're like, well, I don't want to look at that. Whatever's going on there, like maybe me feeling bad is not healthy.
Right.
Like I'm not, and
it means there's something wrong with you.
Yeah, or there's something wrong with you, right? And so it's like, and it's unpleasant enough that you're like, well, I'll just, keep going. It's already happened. There's nothing I can do about it. So it might as well be okay, because what am I going to do about it if it's not okay? Yeah. So and then, and I think this is pretty common for women in university to hook up with people, right? It's called hookup culture. There's Tinder, like it happens. But I like for anybody out there who's thinking maybe I don't want to do that, it's not fun. It doesn't make you feel good. It really makes you really lonely, right? It's not a good idea.
Why do you think it makes you lonely?
I think because what you're looking for is a connection with somebody. And you're getting this physical connection, and you're not getting any emotional connection. And it's
right, and then there's the contradiction.
It's
a terrible contradiction.
Yeah, and it's
here's an interesting thing I used to tell my clients is, don't do anything with anyone sexually that you wouldn't talk to them about.
Seems
like, well, I wouldn't talk to anybody about that. It's like, but you'll act it out, eh?
Yeah.
So that's worth thinking about. So you're not intimate enough with them to have a conscious discussion, but you're perfectly willing to blunder stupidly into it, and then risk the aftermath. A lot of that's fueled by alcohol too.
Yeah, like a lot of it is fueled, like all of it. Yeah. You're not going to do that.
If we ever
sober.
wanted to have a serious conversation about sexual impropriety on campuses, for example, the first thing we'd focus on is alcohol. But we don't want to have a serious conversation about that because, we don't want to have, we don't want to have chaperoned parties like there were in the 1950s. It's like, having some older people around to keep the drunken orgy under control actually turns out not to be such a bad idea.
Especially people who are non-biased, right? Are unbiased. We're just there saying, well, this doesn't look like it's going well. maybe I'll help this person out.
Yeah, well, it's-
instead of a group of friends, they're like, no, do it. Like,
Yeah, right. Well, which is exactly
a bunch of doorknobs running into each other.
Well, that's
Yeah.
what you get with alcohol too. Alcohol is a drug that really radically decreases people's medium to long-term orientation, right? It really focuses you on the present, which makes it, if it's a good drug for you, it makes it unbelievably fun because it decreases anxiety and it increases likely opiate bonding and dopamine-mediated extroversion. And so, like, it's cocaine, heroin, and a benzodiazepine rolled into one. And so it makes you not care. And for pure hedonism, there's nothing better than not caring.
Yeah.
But alcohol is a catastrophe on many fronts because of that. And a huge proportion of violent crimes, exploitative crimes, rapes, a huge proportion of those are conducted between drunk people. And so, but I don't believe that there is moral casual sex. Because I don't think sex is casual. I don't think anything about it is casual.
That's you being lazy, Jordan. That's you being lazy. By the way, throughout this whole controversy, I have told the truth at every turn.
The reason I'm defending freedom of speech, because that's how people with different opinions settle their opinions in a civil society.
Peterson, do you have any comments on the Nazi presence at your protest?
Yeah, I don't like Nazis.
Professor Peterson, let's begin with you. Why are you against the use of alternate pronouns?
I'm against the use of legislation to determine what words that myself and other people are required to utter.
But would you use alternate pronouns if a student asked you to?
I think I've made my position on that clear already.
Well, perhaps not to our audience at home who are just being introduced to this. Would you use alternate pronouns? And why not?
Because I don't believe that other people have the right to determine what language I use, especially when it's backed by punitive legislation. And when the words that are being required are the constructions, they're artificial constructions of people I regard as radical ideologues whose viewpoint I do not share.
Professor Pete, when you hear Professor Peterson saying that this is oppressive, how do you respond to that?
The Peterson drama has done real harm to real people on campus. He's made it harder to be transgender or non-binary. I know this from personal experience. I'm non-binary and transgender, and I know how it's felt to be on the U of T campus for the last month. And I also know from private communications with other affected people. A student once said to me when I finally obtained tenure, "Now, Professor, now that you have obtained superpowers, you must agree to use them for good, for peace and justice." So I invite Peterson to start doing more of that.
Well, Professor Peterson, those who are asking for this alternate use of alternate pronouns, they are saying it boils down to respecting their human rights. How do you respond to that?
I don't think it boils down to respecting their human rights. I think that it's an imposition on freedom of speech that's being implemented at a legislative level. I also think that if there was a naturally evolving solution to the linguistic problem that's being posed by a small fraction of the transgender community, that people would have already adopted it. We've never had a situation in the usage of English before that required legislation to produce a transformation in the manner in which people spoke. It's a very dangerous precedent. So it's one thing to tell people what they can't say. So, for example, we have legislation making it illegal to do such things as deny the Holocaust. It's a completely different thing to demand that people use certain words when they're formulating their own ideas. In New York City, for example, there are now 31 protected gender identities, and I see no reason whatsoever why each of those gender identities can't demand the use of their own pronoun. And that absurd things like that have been happening on the University of Michigan campus, for example, where students have been given permission to tell faculty members and others what pronouns they're to be addressed by, and they're multiplying rapidly out of control. So the law is bad from an ethical perspective. It's sloppily written, and besides that, the solution that it imposes is practically untenable.
Well, I'd like to encourage people struggling with this to be kind as their first impulse. One thing I'd like you to really look at in regard to this controversy is to watch out for who's getting centred in a discussion. Political correctness is code that powerful people use when they're annoyed that they're actually not the centre of attention in any given discussion. And Bill C-16 is actually not about cisgender people, it's about protections for transgender people. And that's not, it's not about Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, well, kindness is the excuse that social justice warriors use when they want to exercise control over what other people think and say. So, if we're bandying back and forth our differences in values, I would say that the highest possible value is truth, and that one of the concomitants is that we need stringent protection for freedom of speech so that we can utter the truths that we see fit. And I think that that's a value that's much higher than kindness, for example. I mean, there's lots of situations in life where kindness in the immediate present is not the appropriate way to react at all.
But
so, for example, when you discipline children, you often hurt their feelings in the short term so that they can learn to behave properly in the medium to long term so that their lives go well. And so this automatic assumption that the people on the social justice warrior side of the equation are motivated only by kindness when they're also clearly motivated by power is something I find completely untenable. And I don't think that Pete's solution to program my cell phone so that I can remember what names people need to be called is a reasonable solution at all. We're actually supposed to now use electronic devices to bolster our ability to speak freely
How do
in
you
case
remember
we
names,
offend
Jordan?
someone.
Is it so difficult to remember a pronoun? You remember somebody's first name, you remember their telephone number. I mean, I think that it's
I don't
very,
remember
very
people's
true
first names
that
very easily, and I don't remember their telephone numbers very easily. And when I see a stranger, I call them by the pronoun that seems to be in accordance with their presented appearance. And
that's you
they
being
appear
lazy,
that way.
Jordan. That's you being lazy. I think there's a very high value that we should also be aiming for in addition to truth. By the way, throughout this whole controversy, I have told the truth at every turn. So, trying to imply that that's not what's happening on people on the social justice, am I a social justice warrior? I don't know. But I think that we should be aiming for pluralism. This means recognizing more than one set of fundamental principles, fostering independent cultural traditions of minorities, and being willing to share power with people who are different than you. I think if you just stop centering this whole controversy on yourself and how hard it is for you to accommodate genderqueer people, well, have a little bit of sympathy. I mean, those of us who are trans encounter much more greater indignities every day and every week of the month.
My refusal to use pronouns because left-wing activists want me to use them has nothing to do with whether or not trans people are having difficulties in society. And I'd also like to point out that I've had many letters of support.
Problem, isn't it?
I've had many letters of support from trans people, and they tell me that the trans activists don't support them, and most trans people
Jordan,
actually wanted to be referred to as he or she.
Doesn't mean
they
that
weren't
you
my
are
friends.
Untransphobic.
They
just
weren't
because
my
you
friends.
know a few people, just because you've talked
I
to a few
didn't know
trans
them.
people, you don't know the trans community like the trans community does. You've got no idea what it's like to be trans.
Professor Pete, Professor Pete, I'm sorry to interrupt. Let's let Professor Peterson finish his thought, please.
All right. So, the trans activists aren't proper representatives of the trans community because they haven't been elected by the trans community.
Nobody elected you either, Jordan.
I'm not speaking for anyone except myself and on behalf of other people perhaps who want to maintain the right to free speech. I'm not claiming that I'm a representative of white people or white men or any other group. I'm speaking on behalf of myself.
Professor Peterson, let me jump in there, though, because we have seen an evolution of language. There are words that we don't use anymore.
Not by legislation.
Well, legislation or not, there are words that have evolved. We don't use, for example, I'm Asian. I would bristle if someone called me Oriental. That is an evolution of how we use words. How is this different, whether legislated or not?
I understand
I understand legislatively, but if at the heart of it is to allow a student to study free of what they feel is discrimination, why not help that along?
I already made my case for why not help that along. I believe that this legislation is extraordinarily dangerous, and there's other elements of it too that we haven't even got to in our society yet, like the protection for gender expression. And I've looked at gender expression in the Ontario Human Rights Code, and as far as I can tell, gender expression is best summarized in a single word: fashion. No. Because it's the way that you present yourself in public with your clothing and your manner of dress. And so I also think that the legislation that we are bringing forth with Bill C-16, and that's already in place in places like Ontario, also makes fashion criticism something akin to a hate crime. And because there's been so much noise about the identity component of this, we haven't even talked about gender expression. This is appalling legislation. And the idea that referring to someone by the pronoun of their choice is going to radically improve their status in society or their mental health is a completely unproven assumption. I think it'll have exactly the opposite effect.
And the only thing that wokeness has to offer in exchange is to brainwash bright young minds like you to believe that you are victims, to believe that you have no agency, to believe that what you must do to improve the world is to complain, is to protest, is to throw soup on paintings. I am so tired of talking about woke culture. That's why it's gone too far, more than anything else. And I thank the other speakers for making the points for me, because it means I don't have to reiterate the point that no, free speech is not some right-wing reframing of whatever. It's the foundation of Western civilization. Upon this civilization is built and the Enlightenment values that led to it. I don't have to make the point that has been made by far better people in the past, that the only way to deal with the problem of racism is to treat people on the content of their character and nothing else. And the fact that woke culture seeks to overturn that is a new form of racism that we must all oppose. It means also I will not use this opportunity to say I told you so, as someone who spent the last 5 years warning people in the West that if we continue to erode our culture, if we continue to undermine our confidence in Western values, that our enemies like Vladimir Putin will seek to capitalize on it. I will not make any of those points tonight. I want to talk to those of you who are woke and who are open to rational argument. A small minority, I accept. Because one of the tenets of wokeness is, of course, that your feelings matter more than the truth. But I believe in you. I believe there are those of you here who are woke, who are open to rational argument, so let me make one. We are told that your generation cares more than any other about one issue in particular, and that issue is climate change. We're told that many of you suffer from climate anxiety. You wish to save the planet. And for tonight, and tonight only, I will join you. I will join you in worshipping at the feet of Saint Greta of climate change. Let us all accept right here, right now, that we are living through a climate emergency and our stocks of polar bears are running extremely low. I join you in this view. I truly do. Now, what are we to do about this huge problem facing humanity? What can we in Britain do? We can only do one thing. You know why? This country is responsible for 2% of global carbon emissions, which means that if Britain was to sink into the sea right now, it would make absolutely no difference to the issue of climate change. You know why? Because the future of the climate is going to be decided in Asia and in Latin America by poor people who couldn't give a shit about saving the planet. No, thank you. No, thank you. It's going to be decided by poor people in Asia and Latin America who don't care about saving the planet. You know why? Because they're poor. Because they're poor. I come from Russia, which is not a poor country, it's a middle-income country. 20% of households in Russia do not have an indoor toilet. What they have is an outdoor toilet. And I don't mean one of those nice portaloos that we get here. I don't even mean a Glastonbury portaloo. I mean a wooden shack with a hole in the ground that holds a collected fermented memory of the last 10,000 visits. How many of you are going to go home tonight and say, let's rip out our bathroom and erect a Siberian shithouse in the back garden? And if you're not, why should they? 120 million people in China do not have enough food. I don't mean that they don't get dessert. I mean they suffer from malnutrition. That means that their immune system is breaking down because they don't have enough food. You're not going to get them to stay poor. Imagine you're Xi Jinping, the leader of China. When you were 10 years old, there was a revolution, a cultural revolution in your country, and people came and they put your father in prison. Your mother had to denounce him. Your sister killed herself. And you, no longer enjoying the protection of your formerly powerful father, were sent to a village where you lived in a cave house. And here you are, decades later. You have clawed your way up the bloody and greasy pole of Chinese politics to be the undisputed supreme leader of the very Communist Party that destroyed your family. And you know that the main thing you have to do to survive and to stay in power is to deliver the one thing that the people of China want: prosperity, economic growth. Where do you think climate change ranks on Xi Jinping's list of priorities? 1/3 of all children who live in extreme poverty in the world live in India. That means they are starving and dying of preventable disease. Now, about 15 months ago, my wife got pregnant. Not me, because we're old school. And for 9 months, we talked about what our boy would look like, what he might do when he grows up. We looked at baby scans and videos on YouTube about what the fetus looks like at 9 months and 12 months and 20 months. And eventually he was born. And he is this cute little bundle of joy. He's cuter than about 80% of puppies, right? Now, if you said to me that I had a choice, either my son had a serious risk of starving or dying from a preventable disease in the next year, or I could press a button and he would live. He would go to school. He would bring his first girlfriend home. He'd go to university and graduate and become a woke idiot. And then he'd get a job and get married and have children and become a man. But all I have to do is press this button. And for every day of my son's life, a giant plume of CO2 is going to get released into the atmosphere. Now, you're all very young, and most of you are not parents. Let me tell you something. There is not a parent in the world who would not smash that button so hard their hand bled. You are not going to get these people to stay poor. You're not even going to get them to not want to be richer. And so, I put it to you, ladies and gentlemen, there is only one thing we can do in this country to stop climate change. And that is to make scientific and technological breakthroughs that will create the clean energy that is not only clean, but also cheap. And the only thing that wokeness has to offer in exchange is to brainwash bright young minds like you to believe that you are victims, to believe that you have no agency, to believe that what you must do to improve the world is to complain, is to protest, is to throw soup on paintings. And we on this side of the house are not on this side of the house because we do not wish to improve the world. We sit on this side of the house because we know that the way to improve the world is to work, is to create, it is to build. And the problem with woke culture is that it's trained too many young minds like yours to forget about that. Thank you very much.
Just for people who haven't thought this through and aren't familiar with it, can you be more precise about what's potentially dangerous and scary? AI is everywhere. People who weren't quite sure what it was are playing with it on their phones. Is that good or bad?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about AI for a long time, since I was in college, really. The smartest creatures, as far as we know, on this earth are humans, is our defining characteristic.
Yes.
We're obviously weaker than, say, chimpanzees, and less agile, but we are smarter. Now, what happens when something vastly smarter than the smartest person comes along in silicon form? It's very difficult to predict what will happen in that circumstance. It's called the singularity. It's, it's a singularity like a black hole, because you don't know what happens after that. It's hard to predict. So I think we should be cautious with AI, and we should, I think there should be some government oversight, because it affects it's a danger to the public. And so when you have things that are a danger to the public, so food and drugs, that's why we have the Food and Drug Administration, right, and the Federal Aviation Administration, the FCC. We have these agencies to oversee things that affect the public, where there could be public harm. and you don't want companies cutting corners on safety and then having people suffer as a result. So that's why I've actually for a long time been a strong advocate of AI regulation. So that I think regulation it's not fun to be regulated. It's somewhat arduous to be regulated. I have a lot of experience with regulated industries because obviously automotive is highly regulated. You could fill this room with all the regulations. The same thing is true with rockets. You can't just willy-nilly shoot rockets off, not big ones anyway, because the FAA oversees that. I think we should take this seriously, and we should have a regulatory agency. I think it needs to start with a group that initially seeks insight into AI, then solicits opinion from industry, and then has proposed rulemaking, and then those rules, will probably, hopefully, grudgingly be accepted by the major players in AI. I think we'll have a better chance of advanced AI being beneficial to humanity in that circumstance.
But all regulations start with a perceived danger. Planes fall out of the sky, or food causes botulism.
Yes.
I don't think the average person playing with AI on his iPhone perceives any danger. Can you just roughly explain what you think the dangers might be?
Yeah, so the danger, really, AI is more dangerous than, say, mismanaged aircraft design or production maintenance or bad car production, in the sense that it has the potential, however small one may regard that probability, but it is non-trivial. It has the potential of civilizational destruction. There's movies like Terminator, but it wouldn't quite happen like Terminator because the intelligence would be in the data centers.
Right.
The robot's just the end effector. But I think perhaps what you may be alluding to here is that regulations are really only put into effect after something terrible has happened.
That's correct.
If that's the case for AI, and we only put in regulations after something terrible has happened, it may be too late to actually put the regulations in place. The AI may be in control at that point. There's great potential for good, but there's also potential for bad. And so if you've got some radical new technology, you want to try to take the set of actions that maximize the probability that it will do good and minimize the probability it will do bad things.
Can you be more precise about what's potentially dangerous and scary? Like, what could it do? What specifically are you worried about?
If you have a super intelligent AI that is capable of writing incredibly well and in a way that is very influential, convincing, and is constantly figuring out what is more convincing to people over time, and then enters social media, for example, Twitter, but also Facebook and others, and potentially manipulates public opinion in a way that is very bad. How would we even know?
And all of that's going to come down the pipes within the next year. Hang on to your hats, ladies and gentlemen. Giants are going to walk the earth once more, and we're going to live through that, maybe.
I think we need to really be, I think we need to regulate AI safety, frankly. Think of any technology which is potentially a risk to people, like if it's aircraft or cars or medicine. We have regulatory bodies that oversee the public safety. It is, I think, actually a bigger risk.
How many of you know what ChatGPT is? Not very many. So I'll tell you what ChatGPT is, just so you know, because you need to know this. And I don't know what sort of technological revolution this is. Gutenberg press level? It's something like that. This is a big deal. So this AI system, it's a general language processing model, was released about a week and a half ago. And I went and interacted with it. It's an AI system, artificial intelligence system. It basically is trained on, well, a massive corpus of spoken or of text. So it's derived its models of the world from the analysis of human speech, essentially. It isn't using real world data yet, but that will be happening certainly within the next year. So And ChatGPT analyzes a very large corpus of text, and that corpus is growing all the time. Now, it's already sophisticated enough. I went on to it last week and I said, okay, some of you know I've written these books, 12 Rules for Life, and then Beyond Order, 12 more rules, because, you know, you can't have enough rules. And I asked it, this is what I asked it to do. I said, write me an essay that's a 13th rule for Beyond Order, written in a style that combines the King James Bible with the Tao Te Ching. That's pretty difficult to pull off, you know. Any one of those things is hard. The intersection of all three, that's impossible. Well, it wrote it in about 3 seconds, 4 pages long, and it isn't obvious to me, for better or worse, that I would be able to tell that I didn't write it. Right, and okay, and that's pretty impressive, although, you know, maybe not its relationship to what I've written, but the fact that it could do that grammatically perfectly, right, and quite impressive philosophically. I also had it write an essay on the intersection between the Taoist version of ethical morality and the ethics that are outlined in the Sermon on the Mount, which it just nailed, got that dead right, brilliant. Again, it took it about 3 seconds. There was a computer engineer who purported to work for Tesla. He asked ChatGPT, he said, look, I work for Elon Musk, but I haven't been doing much for the last week, so I need you to write me 10 bullet points about what I probably would have done as a engineer at Twitter. What 10 things did I do last week that were productive and valuable? And, oh, if you don't mind, write me the accompanying computer code that goes with each project. And it did that too, 3 seconds, and the computer code works. Right, and so, okay, so that's already there. So then a university professor did this. He thought, oh, that's interesting. Any student will be able to write any essay on any topic with ChatGPT. And someone gave it an SAT, by the way, and it scored about as well as the average student in a well-functioning public university. So that's how smart it is. So that's basically an IQ test. He said, write me an essay, gave it a topic, wrote the essay. He said, now grade it. Said if we can automate the students, we should be able to automate the professors too. And so it provided a complete, comprehensive analysis of its own essay with grade. Someone else asked it, write the screenplay and describe the characters for the next $900 million Hollywood blockbuster. It's like, bang, plot, characterizations. Then someone else took the descriptions of the actors and said, generate photorealistic computer images for each actor. And all the AI systems could do that. So I'm going to tell you what's going to happen next. Now we have an AI model that can extract a model of the world from the entire corpus of language. All right, and it's smarter than you, and it's going to be a hell of a lot smarter than you in 2 years. So you can get ready for that too. But it's not that smart yet because it's just a humanities professor at the moment. It doesn't test its linguistic knowledge against the real world. That's what a scientist does, right? You come up with a theory that's linguistically predicated, and then you throw it against the world and see if it sticks. And then the world tells you whether or not your linguistic construction is valid. But the new AI systems will be able to extract out patterns from the world itself, from images and so forth, and then be able to test their linguistic constructions against the world, and so they'll practice just like scientists. And the most advanced models are going to use text and image and action as well, because they'll be able to model human action. And so, and all of that's going to come down the pipes within the next year. So hang on to your hats, ladies and gentlemen, because what did my friend Jonathan Pajot say? Giants are going to walk the earth once more. And we're going to live through that, maybe.